Thank you for coming. It is spring break at UW Whitewater, but we are fortunate enough that our speaker today is choosing to spend his spring break with us, so that's awesome. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education. A lot of you hear this every single week, but for those of you who don't, or those of you who might be listening on our Facebook feed or watching this video in the future, I am Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education. We're here today at Fairhaven Senior Services, where we hold the Fairhaven Lecture Series, which we have been doing since 1983. We've had hundreds of faculty members talk on everything from politics to art to current events to you name it. And today we're going to talk about Wisconsin mass media history. So that's pretty cool. Today's presenter is Brian Schanen. He's a lecturer of communication at UW Whitewater. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Communication and his Master of Science in Mass Communication from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. He teaches courses in media production, history, film, and media effects. In addition to teaching, Brian coaches the university's award-winning competitive speaking team. Please welcome Brian Schanen.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It's awesome to see you here, even in the nice weather. As Carrie mentioned, I teach classes in mass communication, and also I've realized as I've grown up that I grew up in a family of storytellers. And so when I got to talk about profiles, I'm like, ooh, goody, I'm going to leverage some of that just kind of personal characteristic, and I'm going to talk about a couple of stories of Wisconsin mass media history. And in my mass communication classes, so often I start off the semester by saying, mass comm started with Gutenberg and the printing press, or Marconi and radio, or Philo Farnsworth and television, or any number of these figures that work in cities like New York and Los Angeles and major cities in Berlin, like Berlin, Germany, or London, England, and things like that. But then I get really interested when I find out that Philo Farnsworth, in the lower left-hand corner of the screen here, really, by trade, wasn't doing anything with electronics when he figured out how to make a TV work. He was actually plowing a farm field and realizing that the crisscrossing rows that he was creating might actually work with electronics. And then I'm like, oh, there's also a lot of cool stories that happen in Wisconsin. And as soon as I start talking about them, the students light up the conversation saying, it's actually really cool that something is happening in Wisconsin. That things that have such a large impact on media history actually happened in our great dairy state. And so I'm going to talk about three different stories today. P.T. Barnum, H Bennett, and then the Paramount Blues Factory. So we're going to start our journey about 15 miles or so south of here in Delavan, Wisconsin, with the story of P.T. Barnum. So P.T. Barnum was really, as somebody put it, the Shakespeare of advertising. He paired up with a gentleman by the name of William Coop from the state of Wisconsin to basically take what P.T. Barnum had created as a show that was a standalone in New York. If you wanted to see it, you had to go meet P.T. Barnum where he was in New York City. But Coop said, well, actually, what if we went and we put it on the road? And so the first ever traveling circus was born. Based out of Delavan, Wisconsin, because that's largely where Coop's background was. But then I thought to myself, well, why in Wisconsin? Well, there was a lot of logs, so good firewood for winter, for heat, and plenty of farm fields for grazing. I don't think an elephant chilling out in the middle of winter in New York City would necessarily fit, but the large farm fields in southern Wisconsin served a great home. So during its peak, there were about 25 different circuses that would actually winter in Delavan, Wisconsin. Story has it that at the bottom of one of the lakes in Delavan, there is an elephant that took a winterly stroll and didn't test the ice before stepping foot out onto it, and whoop, into the lake the elephant went. But so many of these circuses were largely advertising tools in and of themselves. Barnum was known for creating this massive commotion around his events. He wanted to maximize the number of people that would come, pay, see his show, and oftentimes it was the way that people would see elephants and giraffes and all of these different things, because they couldn't just hop in the family car and take a leisurely day at the local zoo. The circus was how a lot of those things came to town. And before they would ever actually bring the elephants into town, they would send out an advance team that would plaster the town with posters about come see XYZ, whatever it might be. And then the circus would eventually come to town, but the advertising wouldn't stop there. Coop and Barnum decided, we're going to put all of our materials on trains so we can transport them more easily around the region. And being in Wisconsin, they could go east, they could go west, wherever they decided that they wanted to avoid their competition for a given season. And so the train would come to the train station and they would offload all of those things, but they wouldn't have the show in that physical location. They would have to go across town somewhere. Now, this wasn't lost on Barnum or any of the circus masters, and so they would create a parade and parade through town with all of their materials and all of their circus wagons. All of them oftentimes carrying supplies for their massive canvas tents, presumably food for the animals, and all of the different things that they would need to put on the show. And they would wheel it through town. And the citizens would come out and see the circus train go from the train to wherever the physical circus was going to be. And then the people would follow and watch the circus. All in an effort to make sure that people were coming in under the big top to see their big shows. Presumably with Barnum's idea of creating a massive event that everybody would want to come and see. And so Delavan, Wisconsin was very much one of those major roles in beginning modern advertisements. How many things we see when we turn on the television or the radio or look at the newspapers and they're saying the big greatest thing is coming? We can thank P.T. Barnum and his idea of ballyhoo and the circus for some of that advertising terminology. And so we're going to travel up the road a little bit to Kilbourne City and the story of H Bennett, or Henry Hamilton Bennett. Now, and Hamilton Bennett's main focus was with cameras and taking photography. And in the early days of photography, you lived and died by the light. If you didn't have the light, that photo wasn't going to turn out. It was about exposing metal or glass to different amounts of light. And that amount of light would then determine how well that photo came out, many of which you only had one image. It produced one image, and you couldn't create many copies of it. Some technology would eventually make that a little bit better. And so what the process of taking a photo would involve would be basically taking this material, coating it in chemicals, oftentimes chemicals that today we would probably just want to make sure we never come in contact with because it would lead to health problems down the line. And then they would expose it to light for a very specific amount of time. The more light you had, the shorter the amount of time that you had to expose it. So if you're in a dark room like this, the subject would likely have to sit still for a very long time for the proper amount of exposure to happen for the image to stick. But if we walked outside, nice, bright, sunny day today, would probably take us only a couple of seconds that we would have to sit still, because if we moved, it would mess up the image. And so the traditional practice would be to take a lens cap, pull it off of the camera, wait the designated amount of time, and put the cap back on. But as you put that cap back on, you're hoping the entire time that you don't bump that tripod or that image you were just trying to take will be for naught. And sometimes they would utilize things similar to this that would either horizontally or vertically would be able to allow light in and then block it back out. Hamilton Bennett was so keen to this that he would oftentimes, when trying to gain his different landscapes, would paint the walls of the geographic feature he was picturing around white. He would whitewash them in order to make sure he was getting the right amount of reflection. And then later in the day, he would often return back and try to do it again with a different amount of light to see if, hey, maybe would this look a little bit different. But the thing that became very tricky with all of this process was that you had to make sure that you were timing everything right, planning things out seconds in advance. And so people wanted to begin to picture motion. It's great to take a portrait when somebody is sitting still and off with the lens cap. Wait, put the lens cap back on, do some treatment, you're done. But if you wanted to capture something like a horse running, it would be a little bit more challenging. And so one of the earliest examples was out in California. A gentleman by the name of Edward Muybridge got commissioned by the governor of California at the time, Stanford, to figure out if when a horse was running, would all of its feet leave the ground. Estimates are about somewhere in the range of $25,000 to $50,000 Governor Stanford spent on trying to answer this riddle. No idea where that money came from, but he was darn determined. And so what Muybridge did was he took a bunch of these cameras that had shutters that looked like this and timed them out, lined up about 20 cameras in a row, put tripwires across the track, let the horse run, and as the horse ran along, it would trip the tripwires, drop it so it would stop exposing. And yes, a horse does leave the ground when it's running. Could you imagine tripwires across a United States football field every time you want to catch a Green Bay Packers touchdown? Well, it would be a pretty extensive process. And so that's where H Bennett comes in, because he said there's got to be a better way. H Bennett grew up, was actually born in Canada, and came with his uncle down to Kilbourne City, which is now known as the Wisconsin Dells. And with his uncle, they set up a photography studio. It was pretty successful, but eventually the uncle, at the behest of the uncle's wife, got moved back out to Vermont, and the photo studio shut down. There was a massive run on the photo studio before they closed, and then H Bennett would go off to the Civil War. He would serve with the Union Army, and about 3 weeks short of finishing his service to the Union Army, had an unfortunate incident with his gun, and it lodged a bullet in the finger of his right hand. And he would end up spending about the next 4 weeks recovering from that. And he would note that it would still be painful for a long time afterwards. But after his service was done, he would move back to Kilbourne City and tried to start up another photography studio. This time around, it wasn't as successful. He struggled. And so him and his wife would move out to Tomah, Wisconsin. After giving up his dream of that studio in Kilbourne City, or so he thought. While he was out in Tomah, he would begin just traveling the countryside, basically being that portable photographer, taking portraits around in smaller cities in western Wisconsin. Eventually, his wife would go back to Kilbourne City in an attempt to start to raise the family, and H Bennett would follow some years later. They decided they were going to give it one last shot with that photography studio in Kilbourne City. This time, something was different. some people were starting to come as tourists to Kilbourne City to see the rock formations and the landscapes around the area. And so the portrait business actually stuck this time. So much so to the fact that his wife would just eventually start running that studio, and H Bennett would go out and begin taking photographs along the shores of the Wisconsin River, creating stereographs. And the easiest way I can describe stereographs is an early version of 3D photography. They would look something like this, basically kind of a pair of binoculars. And you would get little cards that you would line up with it, look through the lens, and feel like you were there. So this technology worked out wonderfully for H Bennett, who was trying to showcase all of the rock formations along the Wisconsin Dells, the geographic formations. And so he would use the camera in the lower right that had two lenses and would create these stereographs. Being the ever enterprising inventor that he was, Bennett would create as many tools as he could in order to do what it is that he wanted to do. If he couldn't find it in a mail order catalog or something like that, he would create it. And so he would begin selling these stereographs of the Wisconsin River and selling them in mail order catalogs. And we could say the spirit of P.T. Barnum was very much in him, because people would buy these up and would want to see the place for themselves. Increase of tourism in Kilbourne City, increase of people coming in to his studio. Wanting to see the rock formations, he would start offering basically rowboat-like tours of the Wisconsin River. And eventually, some other more entrepreneurial individuals would bring steamboats into the Wisconsin River, and H Bennett would team up with them. And what he would do is he would ride along with the people on these boat tours on the river and take their order for more stereographs. And in the lower deck of the boat, he had a canoe. Once he had his orders, he would sneak off of the boat and row back to his studio, prepare the stereographs for when the tourists returned. And the stereographs were ready for them to take home with them. And eventually, he would start taking some people along with him when he escaped out the back end of the steamer on the Wisconsin River, and would take them over to a rock formation known as Stand Rock. Because at this point in time, they didn't have docks or anything like that. But in all of his work on the river, one of his biggest dreams was to capture and travel along with the loggers that worked on the Wisconsin River. And so he needed something that would pick up motion. A rock will stand still all day long, but somebody working on logs on the river, that won't happen. And so what he started to do was started to concoct a contraption that he could press the button, cause the exposure, close it right away at the instant that he wanted it for his photographs. And so he would produce something in 1886 using rubber bands as a way that you press a button, creates the exposure, captures the moment. He can take it back to his studio and develop it into his final product. So he creates this invention and he needs to test it out. And he did what any good father would do in 1886 and took his only son, H Bennett, out there and said, please jump between these two rocks 20 times, because I want to make sure I get the image that I want. Now, the gap is somewhere just shy of 6 feet, so somewhere about my height. But the photos make it look a lot wider. And he would capture this fateful image of H Bennett jumping between the two rocks. He took this photo out to New York to show it off, and people were aghast by it. But he also had his detractors. He didn't have Photoshop, but early in his career, he had been noted for doctoring some photos. So some people kind of doubted that this was a real image. But since then, the authenticity of it has been confirmed. And the boat tours would eventually make a stop there, and the tour guides would make the jump. And then eventually, probably some insurance companies got involved, and now they have a dog do it. But capturing that motion, so we can thank H Bennett for all of those amazing photos of different action in our favorite events for his work with the instantaneous shutter. But in winter of 1886, he wanted to take his photography a step further. A gentleman out in New York had written something kind of not so positive about the upper Midwest in winter. And H Bennett kind of wanted to prove him wrong. And so in St. Paul, Minnesota, each winter they had an ice festival. And so he took his camera gear out there and would photograph this giant castle structure in broad daylight, would leave the camera there, and then returned later that evening during the fireworks show, and took another exposure, and through the magic of layering them, created the first ever known photograph of fireworks. Now, at this point in technology, it was likely that he was able to copy these and then reproduce them. However, this was very shortly after this photo was taken. The advancements in photography had advanced so far in that having somebody specific to take your photos started to become irrelevant. Kodak would release the Kodak Brownie, which was a consumer-grade type of camera that you would purchase the camera, take your photos, basically mail the camera back to Kodak, and they would develop it. And so the industry that Bennett had worked so hard on really started to fall apart at the turn of the century, right around 1900, 1906, in that time frame. So within 20 years, the work of H Bennett, very much appreciated, but at the same time, the idea of having just a singular studio as the only place where you could get a photograph started to become less of a major role. So now we're going to take a road trip out to Lake Michigan and to where I grew up in Port Washington, Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee in Ozaukee County, for the story of the Paramount Blues. And so on the right-hand side is a picture of what the lakefront looks like today. And on the left is what that same area looked like right around the turn of the century. And just before 1900, this factory, the Wisconsin Chair Factory, and the entire surrounding neighborhood burned to the ground. They would rebuild and still produce plenty of tables and chairs. Both my sister and I believe that we have some of those tables and chairs in our households. But as a furniture manufacturer, one of the common things around this point in time was also to create phonograph cabinets, essentially an early version of a record player. And what would be a better way of helping to sell more phonograph cabinets than to sell the vinyl records, or the records that would be played in them? And so began the Wisconsin Chair Factory's escapade into producing records. And so they would struggle at first to find their niche. But they quickly realized that there was some groups of people that just weren't getting the record deals. They weren't getting recorded, but when they did, they were finding success. Specifically, black women blues players that had been in vaudeville theaters. So the likes of Ma Rainey, Ida Cox, Jelly Roll Morton would become singers, essentially, under the Paramount Records label. At first, they would go to studios in New York and be recorded because that's where they were. But also these performers were migrating north out of Louisiana, New Orleans, up through St. Louis, up into Chicago. I'm not much of a blues historian, but there is specific types of blues genre called Chicago blues because of their development in Chicago. And so eventually they were recorded in Chicago, and then eventually getting recorded actually in Grafton, about 10 miles south of that factory that I had pictured up there. And so they would sell these records, but the history has it that these weren't very high quality records. Records were oftentimes produced with some vinyl, but also some other materials. And having been a furniture factory, oftentimes there was wood chips and wood shavings that would make their way into the record. And so the quality of these records wasn't all that phenomenal. And so they found quite a while of success with this. They would have a gentleman by the name of Spire who owned a furniture store down in, I believe it was in Mississippi, kind of serve as a local talent scout around that area for possible musicians that could come under the blues or the Paramount Records label, actually. The Depression, however, in the 1930s did not do well for Paramount Blues. And in 1932, they would close the studio. And in 1933, they ultimately closed the production factory that was located on the river of the Milwaukee River in Grafton. However, how they shut down was not the most positive. The way the story goes is during their year-end Christmas party, the employees were notified that the factory was closing and that they weren't going to be getting their year-end monetary bonus. But here are some of the original records, like the originals that other records would get copied off of, as well as some of the extra records. Mind you, the employees weren't too happy about this. So they climbed to the roof of the factory, threw the originals, threw the records into the river below. And the records would shatter, some would float down the river, probably pass through Milwaukee and out into Lake Michigan. And so in one night, much of the work of the Paramount Blues recording studio was lost to the Milwaukee River. It would take another couple of decades for some of the records that happened to survive that night to appear in thrift shops, rummage sales, estate sales, and things like that. And so over the past 40 years or so, Grafton has started to kind of claw back its blues heritage, as more of these originals have been found and confirmed that they were indeed produced in Grafton and as part of the Paramount record label. And so in 2006, Grafton finally created the Grafton Blues Association to embrace that story that they had from the earliest 20th century. This blues heritage of producing records in Grafton, Wisconsin. And so through the stories of P.T. Barnum, H Bennett, and the Paramount Blues, we can see the legacy that Wisconsin has on mass media history. When I talk to my mass media studies students early in the semester, I tell them, if you want to see the interesting things that are happening in the development of media, don't look in the obvious places like Gutenberg and Farnsworth and Marconi, but look to the edges, to the more unique stories, because you'll find some very interesting stories, and who knows, you might even find some very local stories as well. So with that, I will open the floor to questions.